In the mid-1920s, Alfred Sloan decided that there were gaps in the market that the GM lineup did not cover at the time. The solution was to create new brands spun off of existing brands to fill those gaps. The GM Companion Make Program. LaSalle would be the budget Cadillac, Marquette would be spun off of Buick, Viking from Oldsmobile, and Pontiac from Oakland. With introductions just prior to the Great Depression, perhaps their failure was inevitable. Pontiac would be the first to arrive in 1926 as an entry-level 6 to fit just above the Chevrolet in price, selling $50,000 its first year and more than tripling that within 2 years. They would effectively replace their parent division Oakland in 1931, making it the one successful companion make of the program, lasting until 2010. LaSalle would be introduced in 1927, and it would survive through 3 generations. Like Cadillac, it was named after one of the founders of Detroit. Early models were supposed to be more European than the more expensive Cadillacs, lighter, sleeker, and more stylish. But they did use a version of the Cadillac V8, initially as a 5-liter 303 on a 128 or 134-inch wheelbase. They were able to maintain speeds in excess of 95 miles an hour. Shortened to an 125-inch wheelbase for the smaller models in 1928, they would be upgraded in 1929 to a 5.4-liter 328, then a 5.6-liter 340 in 1930, and a 5.8-liter 353 for 1931. But like most brands, it was hit hard by the Depression. The second-generation cars arrived for 1934, now sharing their basic structure with Buick and Oldsmobile. Down to a 119-inch wheelbase, the engine moved to an Oldsmobile 4.1-liter 248 cubic inch straight-eight with 95 horsepower, down 20 horsepower. And prices were reduced to about $1,600 from $2,400. Sales started to recover, doubling to just over 7,000. 1937 models once again became more like Cadillac, with a 5.3-liter 322 cubic inch 125 horsepower V8. Wheelbase was up to 124 inches, but starting price was down to $1,300, and sales would peak at $32,000. For 1939, they were effectively entry-level Cadillacs, with sales around $20,000. But 1940 would be the last production year, being replaced by the Series 61 Cadillac the following year. Although the LaSalle name would be used on a number of prototypes and concepts over the years, it never made a real comeback. Viking, in reference to the Nordic adventurers, was essentially a variation of the Oldsmobile Light 8, using a 4.3-liter 260 cubic inch engine, producing 81 horsepower on a 125-inch wheelbase. It lasted for 3 years, 1929 to 1931, but barely managed more than 7,000 in total sales, making it the least successful of the group from a sales standpoint. Marquette was actually a revived name from GM's early days of buying up minor manufacturers. The new car was on a 114-inch wheelbase and used a 3.5-liter 213 cubic inch 6 with 67 horsepower. Unlike the more expensive overhead valve Buicks, the Marquette used a side valve design. But in spite of first-year sales of over 35,000, 1930 would be its only year, partly because it was believed that these sales came at the cost of Oldsmobile sales. But it was determined that it was not cost-effective to continue the brand, and it was replaced by the Buick Special, while the engine tooling was sent to Germany for use in Opel Blitz trucks. GM's companion make program was generally considered a failed experiment, but GM was hardly the first or only company to create spin-off brands. In fact, the concept of creating new brands to expand into new markets was quite popular in the 1920s. Usually more expensive brands attempting to move down market to get a piece of the entry-level segment dominated by Ford, something the Great Depression encouraged even more, causing the idea to carry into the 1930s. An early example would be the Jewett of 1923, named for the president of Page Detroit. But as was often the case, the cars failed to get the sales to warrant a separate brand, and the Jewett models were rebranded as Page models in 1927. In a similar fashion, Studebaker created the Erskine for 1927, also named for the company president, but it was no match for Ford's new Model A and would only last until 1930. although for 1931 it was effectively replaced by the Rockne, a one-year-only brand named for Notre Dame football coach Knute Rockne. Willys, or Willys, had a number of related brands during its heyday. In addition to the primary Willys Overland, there was the Willys Knight, the Falcon Knight, and the Stearns Knight. But perhaps the only true companion make was the small Whippet of 1926 to 1931. Hudson's Budget Essex division spun off the smaller Terraplane to be promoted by Amelia Earhart. Terraplanes existed from 1934 to 1938, by which point both Essex and Terraplane had been absorbed into Hudson, and Amelia Earhart had disappeared over the Pacific Ocean. That isn't to say that none were successful. In 1928, Chrysler created the DeSoto and Plymouth divisions. As a mid-priced brand, DeSoto would continue through 1961, when it effectively was merged into Dodge, and Plymouth would go on as one of America's leading entry-level brands, in spite of not having a truly independent dealer network, being absorbed back into Chrysler after 2000. And Ford created the Mercury division in 1939 to fill the gap between Ford and Lincoln, a huge gap at the time, but not so much when Mercury was killed off in 2011. After World War II, Ford also created the Monarch and Meteor divisions, a pair of Canada-specific Ford and Mercury spin-offs, Monarch from 1946 to 1961, and Meteor from 1949 to 1976-ish. This wouldn't be Ford's only new divisions of the period, although they may not really be considered companion makes. Continental became its own division above Lincoln in 1956, only to be faded back into Lincoln before the end of the decade, while Edsels were little more than restyled and retrimmed Ford and Mercury models for its short 3 years. Although that was still longer than Packard's one-year-only entry-level Clipper division of 1956. Chrysler also spun off its high-end Imperial as its own division starting in 1955, an effort to try to make them more directly competitive with Cadillac and Lincoln. It quickly became unique from the standard Chryslers, but long-term, it wasn't cost-effective, and the line was absorbed back into Chrysler and killed off for 1976. Then they created the compact Valiant division in 1960 that would become a Chrysler or Plymouth model the following year, depending on what market it was being sold in. But it was around this time that the idea of needing multiple brands to sell a range of different types of cars kind of went away, as brands expanded into more and more diverse lineups. But the idea of brand image being an important part of keeping repeat customers came back around in the 1980s. And even GM would do it again, with Geo, Chevy's first companion make, a division of World Cars that was basically just badge-engineered imports from Japan, cars that were made by Toyota, Isuzu, and Suzuki, many of which were originally badged as Chevrolets before they were moved under the Geo banner, a logo that was a globe with Chevrolet's bow tie logo at its center, and they were still sold through Chevrolet dealerships. It was supposed to distance the imported models from the domestic ones for the sake of image, which may have backfired, but after little more than a decade, the models that remained were once again badged as Chevrolets. Ford created the MARQUIS brand as part of the Lincoln Mercury dealerships to sell European Fords in the U.S. This was done from 1985 to 1989 to stress the fact that they were European. But like most attempts of creating a new brand for marketing reasons, it wasn't particularly successful. Then Honda created Acura in 1986, specifically for the American market to sell its higher-end cars, as most Americans at the time still saw Honda as the maker of small economy cars. More than 35 years later, Acura is still around, but one might question how successful it's been, especially in the more recent years. Toyota created their luxury division Lexus in 1989, arguably one of the more successful companion makes to date, and although they have created some very competitive luxury and performance models, their most popular models remain those that are little more than dressed-up Toyotas. Perhaps ironically, Nissan was once considered the luxury brand to the smaller Datsun, having replaced the earlier Prince brand while continuing the Skyline line. But less than a decade after the cheaper Datsun models became Nissan models, Nissan created a new luxury division, Infiniti. Still going, but it has been less successful than Lexus. Mazda had also planned to launch a luxury division, Amati, but changes in the market killed it off before it was launched. Although it wouldn't be the last attempt at a spin-off make. Toyota would create Scion in 2003. Unlike Toyota's Daihatsu small car division, Scion was intended to capture the practically non-existent youth market. With an average buyer 10 years younger than Toyota, it settled squarely into the middle-aged market. And in 2016, even Toyota admitted that it didn't really serve any purpose. Then in 2010, Dodge started to spin off Ram Trucks as its own division, to let buyers know they were serious about trucks. But history has shown spin-off and specialty divisions are rarely successful, particularly long-term, and often have as much or more negative impact as they do positive, frequently being nothing more than an added expense to the manufacturer. So one has to wonder when and if Rams will once again become Dodges, or if the Ram brand image will be the one to survive. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.